this first lecture, we're going to look at why study Christian history from a woman's perspective, or why study the women of Christian history. And I want to begin with a story from the Gospels, from the life of Jesus. It's a story that may be familiar to you, though I doubt as familiar as some other stories in the Gospel. It's from Matthew 26. It's right before Jesus is executed. He's in Bethany in the house of Simon, a leper, and it says, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. When the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why this waste? For this ointment could have been sold for a large sum, and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring the ointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever this good news, this gospel, is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Now, the first thing I want you to reflect on is the weight that Jesus gives to this woman's action. He so closely associates it with the gospel that he says wherever it's proclaimed in the whole world, her story will be told. So I want you to reflect for a moment. As many times as you've heard the gospel proclaimed, how many times has this woman's story been a part of it? Maybe you've heard the story told before, but is it mentioned every time the cross is mentioned? Does it come up every time redemption is explained? We've not told the story as much as Jesus seems to indicate that we should be telling. The second thing I want you to notice is Jesus only says this phrase about this particular incident. He doesn't say it about anything Peter did, or Thomas, or Judas, or any of the other guys in the story. Only her story is to be told wherever the gospel is proclaimed. Only she is to be remembered all over the world because of this. But let me ask you this. What's her name? Look back through the story. This woman who we're supposed to remember whenever the gospel is proclaimed, she's not given a name. We know the disciples' names, all the men. We know the villains' names, all the men. This woman's name was forgotten, left out. How did that happen? Unfortunately, the story of women in the history of Christianity has been a story of omission and exclusion. And there's a variety of reasons for this. One of them is simply male ignorance, prejudice, envy, and insecurity. Men have sought to be on top. Men have sought power. And in some cases, they have stepped over women or stepped on women to achieve that. It's also the case that when we've told the story of Christianity, more broadly, of our nations and our world, we focused on public politics and great men like Napoleon and Caesar, Abraham Lincoln, people who are viewed to move history along. And for most of human history, women have not occupied these sort of public spaces, and so they've not been included in this great narrative. It's also the case that women throughout history have refused credit for their work. When they have contributed to history, they've not sought a place, not necessarily because of their humility, but simply because there was no space for it in many cultural contexts throughout Christian history. Deferral was the proper attitude and disposition. And lastly, even those women who wanted to announce their place in history, to tell their story, have often lacked the tools to do so, primarily because women have not had access to education and to literacy for huge parts of Christian history. So just like the woman in the story of Jesus' anointing, women have been omitted from history. And this is not a new idea. John Calvin, the great theologian, noticed it way back in the 1500s. Women are rarely mentioned in Scripture. They remain hidden in the shadows. When they do get included in the history, however, they're frequently devalued or demeaned. So maybe you thought of a name for the woman who was washing Jesus' feet. You probably reached back, and even though the story in Matthew 26 doesn't say it, we've inherited a name for this woman, and it's Mary Magdalene. And we've inherited a story to go with her, which is that she is a repentant prostitute. Now, later in this course, we'll return to the story of Mary Magdalene and the mythology that grew around her of Mary, the prostitute with a heart of gold, which is a narrative in our culture. But you notice that's not part of the text. What we do, we have no idea who this woman is. We have no idea what her background is. We just know that she anointed Jesus' feet and he exalted her. But we've come to remember her as a prostitute. Why is that? Why does that sort of thing happen so often? So women have been omitted, and when they're not omitted, they have frequently been devalued and demeaned. Historian Mary Malone, in the beginning of her excellent 3-volume series, Women in Christianity, notes that the history of Christianity shows great ambivalence towards women. On the one hand, women have been included, called, graced, inspired, and canonized by Christianity throughout the centuries. On the other, women have not always felt appreciated within the Christian tradition, and indeed have often felt excluded and oppressed by church leaders. It is this ambivalence towards women that characterizes the whole of Christian history. It's not all bad, but it's certainly not all been good. So, as we're thinking about how to tell the story of women in Christianity, instead of herstory, there's a few things that we should note at the beginning. One, we need to notice the absence of women from the normative historical record. As we've already seen, they're just not there. They're not there in the biblical text, and they're not there in the tellings of Christian history. Second, when they are there, it's often apologetic, trivializing, accidental, or hostile, as in the case of identifying the woman as a prostitute. And so what we need to do, and the goal of this course, is to create a more inclusive historiography. Historiography is simply the word for how we write history, or how we tell a story. Let me tell you a little bit about the history of women's history, Christian women's history. And it breaks down into roughly 3 categories. The first is the great women approach to history. This approach celebrates extraordinary individual women. This is probably what most of you are familiar with. Maybe you've picked up a book like Herbert Lockyer's famous All the Women of the Bible, or another book, Daughters of Eve, popular in Churches of Christ circles. These are the kind of books that you'll find at Christian bookstores. They're very common in Bible class material. You really see a lot of them before the 1960s. And they simply tell the stories of women like Miriam and Deborah and Ruth and Esther, and then in the New Testament, Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Phoebe and Priscilla. What these women, a little bit of their stories, why they're faithful, really holding them up as examples of Christian faith. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with this approach to history, but it's not a critical form of history. All this changed around the year 1968, and if you know a little bit about intellectual history, Western history, you know that the late 1960s was a great time of intellectual ferment, including a time of the feminist revolution, specifically second wave feminism. First wave feminism focused on political rights, like the right to vote. Second wave feminism moved a little deeper, pushed for social and cultural changes. Now, a lot of people are put off by the F word, feminism. There are a lot of misunderstandings and bad definitions floating around about what feminism is. So let me just give a really basic definition. This is from Marie Scheer. You might see it on a bumper sticker. Feminism is the radical notion that women are people. That's all it means. Feminism is an argument for the equality of women and men. So here is a more scholastic definition from Mary Paula Walsh's Feminism and Christian Tradition. She identifies feminism as the political and social efforts of women and men directed towards ending sexist domination, with all that the latter may imply in terms of racial, economic, and other patterns of stratification. So feminism is all about equality and the ending of domination. Let me introduce two related terms to this, just so you're familiar with them. One is the term patriarchy. This is another term that gets misunderstood. Patriarchy, in a very simple sense, can be a male-headed household. In some ways, this is an idea that you'll find throughout the Bible. But the way that the term is used within feminist discourse is not simply in terms of an individual household, but a social hierarchy that governs all human relations. So one definition is a patriarchy is a pattern in which men hold the power and women are disenfranchised or excluded from power. So men are elevated above women. It's important to note that patriarchy is not only bad for women, but it also is bad for some groups of men, especially men who come from various kinds of minorities. So patriarchy is generally bad for human beings in the way that it's understood in second wave feminism. Let me just note and be really clear, feminism is not saying that women are superior to men. That would be matriarchy, which would be the complement of patriarchy. Feminism is an argument for equality, not for the domination of one gender over the other. A related term is androcentrism. Andro, the Greek word for man, centrism, center, simply men at the center of things. This is the belief that the male or masculine view is normative. The way that men see the world is the right way, the normal way, the objective way to see the world. A correlation is the way men tell the story of history is the way history ought to be told. I like this definition, which goes all the way back to 1903. Lester Ward says, androcentric theory is the view that man is primary and woman secondary, that all things center, as it were, about man, and that woman, though necessary to the work of reproduction, is only a means of continuing the human race, but is otherwise an unimportant accessory and incidental factor in the general result. Now, this all may seem antiquated to you. Surely no one thinks that men are central and women are peripheral. And it is certainly a less common view than it was in the mid-20th century. But yet sexism is still with us. And sexist ways of telling history are still with us. And Christian history are still. I'll just give you one example of androcentrism. It's not always malicious. When we're thinking about history, we often think in terms of periods. So in terms of Western history, we move from classical antiquity to the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. But in a justly famous article, Joan Kelly Goodall, a feminist historian, asked the question, did women have a Renaissance? In other words, is this historical periodization built around male achievements and male perspectives? If we're telling the story of women, does anything actually change in the Renaissance? You can read her whole article. She argues, well, not really. In terms of church history, we can ask the same thing. Is the Reformation apply to women? Do women's lives change because of the Reformation? In this case, the answer is yes, they do change significantly, and we'll talk about that. The point here is simply that when certain categories are assumed, there may be an androcentric bias, and we need to question and consider that. So, feminist critiques, critical history, beginning in the 1960s, caused scholars and historians to go back and to think about history differently. So instead of just holding up great women from the Bible or great women from Christian history, they started looking more at the context. The context not only of the great women, but of ordinary women, wives and mothers, not only upper class but lower class, not only women from the dominant ethnicity, but minorities. And they began to look at the power structures by which one group oppressed other groups. So that's the sort sort of second stage of the history of women in Christianity. We can break it down just a little further into three stages. The first was the harshest and most critical. This is right at the beginning of the second wave feminism. This is the real critique of patriarchy and misogyny. An example of this is Rosemary Radford Ruether's Religion and Sexism. She's one of the great feminist theologians of the 20th century. A second stage, beginning in the late 1970s, characterized by Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza's In Memory of Her, is the historical recovery of suppressed history. So instead of focusing on misogyny and all of the sexism, she goes back and says, let's try to find women's voices that have been suppressed. Let's look in the shadows, as Calvin says, and see where the women are, and see if we can see what they're doing. So bringing the focus back to women rather than what men have done to women. And then beginning in the 1980s and into the 90s, we see a more theological turn in this dialogue, characterized by Sally McFaig's Models of God. And she's asking larger questions of how do we think about salvation? How do we think about who God is? Can images from women's experience help us have a fuller picture of God? So all these are part of that critical feminist historical approach. Now our course really picks up after this, and we're going to work in something which can be called redeemed history. Feminist approaches aren't perfect, and a lot of people, a lot of Christians have noted that it's often taken too far. And so instead of reading the Bible critically in a way that helps us know God better and love our neighbors better, sometimes the Bible just becomes a tool to advance certain agendas. It becomes, in its own way, another tool of oppression. And so we want to glean all we can from those critical insights, but we also want to acknowledge the diversity of belief and the membership of all Christians through the ages. So it's not just to bash men, but it's to redeem these stories. Redeemed historiography consists of three related concepts. One, as we look through the history of the church, we're going to try to include women's lived experiences as sources of embodied knowledge. So one of the fundamental assumptions is that men and women are different. We don't have the same life experience. Pamela Dickey Young has outlined some of the things that make a woman's experience unique. One, women have different bodies than men do. Women experience menstruation. Women experience, many women anyway, childbirth and menopause. Because of the reproductive system, they have a different bodily experience. Second, women have a different social experience. It's different for a woman to walk down a quiet street at night than for a man to walk down a quiet street at night. There are different expectations around women. Third, Young points to feminized consciousness. And this is just a way of saying men and women view the world differently, that our minds work somewhat differently. For example, these are generalizations, but a male experience is characterized by competition and aggression, whereas woman's experience is sometimes characterized by nurturing and interconnectedness. Again, these are generalizations, but they're ways that men and women see the world differently. Fourth, men and women have different historical experiences. Don't forget how recent it is that women have had access to certain public institutions. They've only had the right to vote for less than 150 years. They've only been allowed into some universities. For instance, Yale only began admitting women in 1969, within the lifetime of many of our parents. And women still don't have access to certain sorts of positions in society. For instance, we've never had a president. We never had a majority of women in Congress or in CEO positions. Women have had a different historical experience than men. And lastly, women have different individual experiences. So first, we want to include those experiences as source of knowledge. Second, in our approach to Christian history, we're oriented towards the church, toward the church's teaching and practices. We want to look at this history in a way that builds up the church, that makes it stronger and better, in faith that this is the body of Christ and the instrument by which God has chosen to redeem the world. So we're not trying to be critical in order to demean or destroy or tear down the church, but to make it stronger and better. And one of the ways we do that, at least that's an assumption of this course, is that we can utilize some of the insights of feminist theory to confront contemporary issues, not just that face women, or even just Christians, but all humanity. Everyone is better when we take these feminine concerns into consideration, because what we're really doing is we're taking into account the vulnerable, the marginalized, the weak, the overlooked, and what could be more Christian than an approach like that? Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, who I mentioned a moment ago, notes this at the beginning of her book. The attempt to write women back into early Christian history should not only restore early Christian history to women, but also lead to a richer and more accurate perception of early Christian beginnings. In other words, it's not just good for women to do this kind of history, it's good for everyone. As Andrea Turpin says, like facets of a diamond reflecting the divine image, we need to see and hear from one another in order to appreciate the fullness of the beauty of who God is. If our story is a story which is primarily about men, we're not getting the whole picture, because God has not only worked through men, He's worked equally through men and women. And if we want to know the fullness of God's work, we need to, as much as possible, hear the fullness of both sides of that story. Teresa of Lisieux, who we'll learn about later in this course, a really famous Catholic saint in the modern period, famous reflection called Little Flowers. She says, the splendor of the rose and whiteness of the lily do not rob the little violet of its scent or the daisy of its simple charm. If every tiny flower wanted to be a rose, spring would lose its loveliness. Perfection consists in doing His will, and being that which He wants us to be. It's not about being a man or a woman. It's not about being great or humble, upper class, lower class, dominant or marginal. What Therese is saying is that God is working through all people in all parts of history. And so we want to see with as big a lens as possible. Now here are some specific assumptions in this class as we get started. One, we're going to see that women have had public leadership roles. Now the goal of this class is not to push an agenda, but simply to see where have women led in the past. This includes teaching, preaching, prophesying, evangelizing, founding monasteries, schools, and churches. We're going to actually see an extraordinary range of activity of women throughout history. But, picking up on what Therese said, we're also going to note that women have served their families and their neighbors consistently throughout human history in humble ways that we will never know about until eternity. We just don't have access to many of these stories, but as much as possible, we'll continue to go back and say, let's not forget, in this period, there's all these women who are simply serving in a Christ-like and humble way. And finally, all vocations, all ways of life, married people, celibate people, active women, contemplative women, all of them are a part of God's work. All of them, as Therese says, are flowers in the garden. So those are some things to keep in mind as we enter into the course. I want to conclude with a word from Maya Angelou. Even though I said this class is for the upbuilding of the church, we are going to see some things that are very critical. We're going to see some things that are hard to read, that representatives of the church, leaders of the church, almost exclusively male leaders of the church, have said about women that are degrading and demeaning and unchristian. And so I like what Maya Angelou says, writing as a woman, writing as a black woman. She says, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, it need not be lived again. Why study the history of women in Christianity? Well, it's so that some of the awful things that have happened in the past don't happen again. So that we don't repeat those mistakes. So that we can see what God is doing in all people. Learn to love and respect them. And again, hopefully have a stronger and better church at the end than we did at the beginning.